Well, thank you very much, Edward, for that nice introduction, and thank everyone for coming today. I'm going to talk about the exhibition that's on the second floor of the gallery, and I hope that you'll all look at it carefully afterwards. The landscape photography of Michael Trinny, who exhibits as Chomai, a photographer of profoundly original vision, is often reminiscent of the masterpieces of early Chinese landscape painting. That's not to say that it ever looks exactly like any old painting, or that it faithfully emulates the composition or style of any previous master. But what his work captures is the awe-inspiring majesty and mystery that have led Northern Song paintings such as Fan Kuan's traveling amongst mountains and streams to be so deeply admired by so many later painters and collectors. It may exemplify the observations of the 11th century master Guoxi. A mountain without haze and clouds is like spring without flowers and grass. If a mountain is without clouds, it is not refined. Without water, it is not charming. Without paths, it is not living. Without forests, it is not growing. Without deep distance, it seems shallow. Without level distance, it is not received. And without high distance, it stays low. Some of Michael's photographs are hazy and evoke brushwork of the literati masters. The painterly quality of his work may be amplified when he prints a slice of his film as an album, a hanging scroll, or a hand scroll. Others are crisp and evoke the same breathtaking bareness painted in masterpieces like Fan Kuan's. And this work is on display on the second floor. A longtime resident of Beijing who exhibits under the Chinese name Chomai, one of Trinny's long-term projects is to retrace the Yangtze River photographically by documenting the places from a Song Dynasty hand scroll in the Freer Gallery of Art. His imagery may be contemporary, but his art generally captures the landscape at its own pace of change, a millennium like a day, and thus to human consciousness seeming timeless. His collaborator in the present exhibition, Arnold Zhang, or Zhang Hong, as he is known, is one of the most accomplished contemporary practitioners of ink painting in the scholarly tradition. Profoundly inspired at the age of 9 by an exhibition he visited in his native New York with his father, he asked to study Chinese painting. This notable exhibition was the first American solo show of Zhang Daqian, held at the Herschel and Adler Gallery in 1963. As a teenager, he studied calligraphy and painting with a New York neighbor, the former Shanghai Art Academy Dean Wang Jiyuan, whose calligraphy you see at left. Then as a college student, he traveled to Taiwan to learn the Chinese language and Chinese art. He studied Chinese painting with Guo Yanqiao in Taiwan. His work is at right. And then returned to the U.S. to do graduate work in the history of Chinese painting at Berkeley with James Cahill, who was, in those years, at the height of his powers as a teacher and writer. During Arnold's final summer in Berkeley, he and I had the amazing experience of studying Chinese painting with Wang Jichen at the Chinese Culture Center in San Francisco. C.C. Wang, as he is most often known, was a superbly trained painter in the Suzhou literati style, with such beautiful brushwork that he could paint exactly like Mizan or Hongou Wang or most any literati master. He would correct my poor attempt at painting rocks by adding his own elegant ones around them until the composition began to look right. In retrospect, I realized that this is similar to how he was painting in his own work at the time, creating random dabs of ink using crinkled paper, and then correcting the accidental effects into a coherent landscape. we realized how lucky we were to watch this master's hand at work. Seizing the opportunity, Arnold made the courageous decision to give up academia in order to move to New York to study further with C.C. Wang. And I cannot tell you how envious I was then and remain, not only of his talent, but of his extraordinary courage as a young father to follow this master-disciple relationship in painting. Although he also embarked on a parallel career, one at which he excelled as director of Chinese paintings at Sotheby's, he continued to study the practice of painting with C.C. Wang for the next 25 years, until he emerged with his own personal style. While learning brushwork and composition, he never emulated C.C.'s contemporary works. Instead, some of his early paintings reminded me of the Suzhou artists of the Wu school we had studied in art history class, as though the Ming master Wen Zhengming, whose son and nephew both painted, had had an extra nephew of slightly different temperament. Most notable to my eye in those days was the extraordinary quality of his brushwork, something not seen in the works of anyone else in his generation working on this continent or in China. Since as early as the mid-1990s, this has been paired by a superb sense of composition, as in this work exhibited in the Guggenheim Museum in 1998. From the standpoint of splendid scenery, painting cannot equal real landscape. But from the standpoint of the sheer marvels of brush and ink, real landscape is not at all the equal of painting. This is James Cahill's translation of a passage by Dongqi Chang. While Michael Trinny's work may evoke the Northern Song masters, Arnold paints in the vocabulary of the Yuan and Ming literati. Arnold and Michael first met and appreciated one another's work while exhibiting in the 2007 Chengdu Biennial, which was dedicated to ink art. Trinny exhibited several remarkable accordion-folded albums of photos printed on Chinese painting paper, and Zhang showed fine paintings that stood out for the elegance of his brushwork and the subtlety of his composition. It was one of Michael's albums. Zhang typically builds a coherent landscape composition stroke by stroke, while Trinny deconstructs a photographic landscape by reducing it to blurred lines and dots. The granular textures in Trinny's monochromatic images evoke the autographic brushstrokes of classical Chinese painting, entirely by mechanical means. The two artists, who share a love of classical Chinese painting, happened to meet again in other group exhibitions, and by 2009 had launched their current, rather remarkable artistic collaboration. For lack of a better word, we call their process a collaboration, but it is in many ways a contemporary evocation of the poetic dialogues that characterize some of the great moments of China's literary history. Michael Trinny, who lives in Beijing and travels extensively to photograph throughout China, initiates each piece by choosing a radically cropped black and white photograph to print on slightly textured, handmade paper well suited to painting. He shoots the photographs in black and white on high-speed 35mm film, and then they are processed as slides, radically cropped, as you see in the lines here, blown up, and finally printed. For purposes of their collaboration, he has learned how to print digitally on painting paper that Arnold feels comfortable using, and usually prints the first small image as a hard-edged form surrounded by ample blank space. He then mails the printed sheets to Arnold in New Jersey, gradually composes responses to those that speak to him. As the works in the current exhibition attest, the images or their shapes that Trinny lays out are potentially quite challenging for a Chinese painter. For example, he radically crops a spectacular mountain expanse into a broad inverted pyramid. A striking image in its own right, It presents Zhang with a geometric form never seen in Chinese painting, one perhaps conceived in reference to principles of Renaissance perspective. The painter responded twice, once by casually extending the image with a few matching mountains below the triangle, while such an abruptly cropped panorama seems to cry out for supplementation, the effect of Zhang's sparse but artfully positioned additions is completely unexpected. By breaking the boundary created by the triangle's two short sides with his soft texture strokes, mists and fog, he expands the scene infinitely, contradicting the apparent intention of the photo's hard-edged geometry with his fluid natural forms. In the second instance, he turned the photo upside down, prioritizing his own painting and converting the printed image into a reflection of his painted mountainscape. The atmospheric perspective, barely noticeable in the first photo, is now conspicuous, readable as strange hills or beaches along the shoreline. Moreover, the entire composition, now viewed frontally rather than from above, remains constrained by the long side of the triangle rather than infinitely expanded, as in the previous example. In these examples, Zhang has directly commented on Trinny's art and on the relationship of their common endeavor to the history of Chinese painting. The shapes Trinny applies to other cropped images present different kinds of problems. In a few instances, his choice of image seems to offer a direct commentary on Zhang's previous painting. For example, he sent a sheet on which he had printed images of waterfalls, a motif that appears in most early Chinese monumental landscape paintings, as though inviting Zhang to make a painting that might look like one of his own earlier works. Rather than responding conventionally, however, Zhang pushed back, completely avoiding such a centered composition by opening the center of the picture into a large lake and deconstructing a conventional landscape. In a second example, Trinny cropped the landscape to leave only a perfectly framed and balanced image of a tall rectangular mountain peak. This seems complete in itself. What could a painter possibly add to this? Zhang again overturns expectations by surrounding Trinny's photo with mountains that lean to the left and to the right, destabilizing and animating the previously perfect central mountain in a way that evokes the sparseness of the Anhui school. No longer the tallest of the peaks, it still serves the crucial function of lending its silhouette to those that surround and echo it. Trinny launched an even greater challenge in the format of the folding fan, a standard shape in Chinese painting, particularly for artists of the Suzhou area, to which Zhang's style might be traced. Typically, a landscape fan would leave ample blank space for the addition of poetic comments. Yet Trinny's diagonal image is so densely packed with dark abstract forms that there is no room to add anything to it. In this case, Zhang transforms the scene below the fan's arc into a well-balanced rectangular landscape, diffusing some of the photo's uncomfortable tension and even erasing the fan format altogether. Here, Trinny's photos can be read as commentary on or challenges to the classical tradition of Chinese painting, or in some cases as direct comments on Zhang's body of work. Previous interviews with Arnold Zhang suggest the freedom he finds in this dialogue to fully exploit the art historical traditions in which he is so deeply grounded. Rather than trying to imitate precisely the effect that Michael's granulated photos have, I realized that I'm not trying to paint to make it look like a Michael Trinny photograph. What I'm trying to do is to paint those Chinese paintings that Michael's work reminds us of. The class of people referred to by the historians as Chinese literati no longer exist in the contemporary world, but some of their cultural values remain appealing today. One of the fundamental principles of literati painting is that the work of art reveals the character and accomplishments of the maker. In this ideal, the virtues of the artist, namely his knowledge, intellect, philosophy, instincts, and training, would appear on the paper, and through their traces would enable those who saw the painting to mentally follow them back to their source in the mind of the artist. In Arnold Zhang's brushwork, all of these things, as well as the purity with which he has pursued his passion, for the history and practice of painting is indeed exposed. But even so, how such an exhilarating work of art emerged from them remains inexplicable. These are a pair of paintings that are, this is his painting that's currently on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if you have a chance to visit New York. Michael Trinny, whose photographic process takes him out of his peaceful Beijing studio to the edges of snow-sprinkled precipices in all parts of China, demonstrates the literary virtue of reading 10,000 books and traveling 10,000 miles. These two, working in different forms of art, challenge the boundaries of their media, techniques, and concepts in many different ways, which each artist separately, and both of them together, achieve the calm and elegance of the literary aesthetic in their work as individuals and as a collaborative team. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and more relevant, the artist, Ronald Zhang, is here, so perhaps you can catch him in the gallery afterwards.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you for your coming. Compared to Judy's talk, my talk is completely disorganized. Anyway, when you can see the title on the ink now, this is when I tried to work on this talk, quite ambitious, and try to give you kind of the survey of about the ink art happening in China now. But when I started, I find actually I completely failed, because it's impossible, even with the contemporary advanced technology. So many art shows now in China. I have no way to collect all the information about these shows. So I just, based on my knowledge and ability, to share with you some ink art exhibitions in the recent 3 years showing in China and other places. Anyway, and I think that after the few years of the kind of crazy the market of Chinese contemporary Chinese ink, and in the recent these 3 years, it seems to calm down a little bit. And most of the exhibition we can see here are the many they are the comprehensive kind of survey of the contemporary ink. Some even trace back to the early time. Like this one is kind of the survey of the entire 20th century Chinese ink painting to the contemporary, include this century, the new contemporary art. You can see here, many of you are possibly familiar with this Fu-Bao's painting and Lin Fengmian's, Feng Zikai's, and the Shi Rou's, also including the more recently Chinese ink painter like Qiu Ting, that's much younger artist. So these kind of become quite a trend. We see the several kind of exhibition in that way, and also many kind of ink exhibition is beside these kind of more on the Western oriented kind of the larger concept, the technology. Some it's more traditional kind of the ink paintings also join these trends, showing the many kind of the comprehensive ink exhibition like this one. And many exhibitions actually organized by these the museums that we know in the recent in China. More than 2,000 museums are built in China. So everywhere you can find the public museums and also the private small museums, middle-sized museums, and also many kind of international the museums built up in China. So many exhibitions you can see here. I just collected some and give you the sense. The curators and also the exhibition organizers trying to give you kind of the sense. Some the more international or more national, some the completely local. So the many different kind of exhibitions, and also, but interesting is I feel because in the maybe past almost 20 years, I mainly work on ink art and the contemporary ink art. So so I, based on my observation, is in the Chinese art world, actually people's more open mind. They can deal with the different kind of people with different media, different concepts, and also the different materials. You can see here is the ink art in the quite a diverse ways. And like this kind of also, they started to, some institutions started to do in the more the scholarly and the work, like establish an archive for the contemporary ink, even publish the so-called contemporary ink yearbook. So this kind of the major efforts are made by many institutions, including institutions in Beijing, in the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and also in the many other places, in local places. Even some kind of private organizations started doing things. We see the kind of maybe well-known is in Beijing University, the Professor Zhu Qingsen organized this modern contemporary ink modern contemporary art archive, and also the other places. We can see this organized this. So this like this one is the contemporary kind of the Chinese artists' yearbook, and invited kind of artists to have the exhibition, and also not only this artworks, even including the publications for these kind of scholarly research, and provide quite a good venues for the study. It's completely different from the even 10 years ago when we worked on this Chinese contemporary art. It's really we don't have any kind of scholarly support, but now we do have many kind of institutions provide this kind of support for us. So the art exhibition like this is quite recently start. It's especially dedicated to contemporary ink, they call it contemporary ink yearbook. They published a book, the yearbook for including the most of the important shows. They also, I talked to the organizer of this show. They originally also ambitious, trying to include information for all the ink shows, but also the field, because the too many this shows they didn't really have very good publicity, so impossible to include all. But they tried the best to including the most important shows in the major cities, and also this from the supported by several websites to organize this. And every year they have the exhibition, give the kind of the documentary kind of exhibitions for these shows. It means choose the few works from each major exhibitions to show in there, giving the people's idea, just like I'm doing now. These kind of exhibitions, actually, you can see here, including the artworks by the artists in the content the print day, and the work in quite different. If when we organized 10 years ago, it's in the third Chengdu biennial. Then when the Arno and Michael actually first met in Chengdu, that time is still the contemporary ink still didn't have their status in China yet. But within these 10 years, we see this kind of well-developed, these kind of, no matter in terms of the exhibition system, and also the museum support, and also the this kind of publication, give us more kind of opportunity to know these new artists' work. And the many exhibitions depict the artists, this kind of the private art galleries also played quite an important role. Instead of the completely the commercial, but also some galleries actually did quite a strong effort to organize the more scholarly show there. Just work with the scholars, work with the art institutions. We can see this kind of effort is quite obvious. And also maybe you have to thank to the calm down of the market. so they they can willing to put some kind of effort into the more scholarly work. And these kind of exhibitions we can show you here is all the group exhibitions. This include the different kind of styles. And artists themselves, we can also see they play we use this kind of opportunity to really develop their own painting style and painting techniques, working in all different kind of way, no matter the related to the traditional Chinese art or the link to the contemporary Western art. And on this show, I think several artists actually joined in many years ago. In Beijing, this is called the Loft Mountain, and also the Flowing Water. This is the second time they organize. So we see this kind of show, it's kind of series show. It's not necessarily every year. The series show, the continues this kind of effort is also quite obvious. And also recently several exhibitions like this one is dedicated to not only China, including the Asian, the other countries in Asia. This show is organized by the Taiwanese curator Wang Jiaji at the Yingchuan. It's very newly built up this Yingchuan Art Museum. It's very kind of postmodern architecture there. Although it's really remote and far away from the center of China, but in the Ningxia, in Yingchuan, the capital of Ningxia, it's really nowhere before. No one knows that. And where is Yingchuan? But they built the beautiful kind of art museum over there, and they tried very hard by the director, also from Taiwan, Xie Shuzhen, to organize the exhibition. So the Wang Jiaji had the exhibition, including not only Chinese artists, also the artists from other parts of Asia, to have this show. And also several exhibitions, especially dedicated to ink, also became the regular. When we did this, 2007, did this third Chengdu Biennial, dedicated to that biennial into the ink art. That time is still quite well. The only one place in Shenzhen by the group of the Shenzhen scholars organized the Shenzhen International Ink Biennial. At that time, is only a venue, but now we see more and more of these kind of this kind of venue dedicated to ink. Like this one is the first, the Wuhan, the ink biennial organized start from this year. Actually, last month, the first show here, and it's a very long time continuing showing to the end of this year. And the second divided to the three parts. The second parts will open in the next month. Actually, is this month or next month? Today, 30. Okay, it's the next month, October. So also this is the series show we see here, including the artists in the many different kind of style, is dedicated to the contemporary ink too. The artists are working. This is just give you, but also I have to confess, it's not necessary. Some works possibly confused myself, so possibly not in this show. But anyway, this is but this one actually this art they include, and this is not necessary. This some artists work in the other. But anyway, this kind of efforts, and also you can see these all different kind of the way, and in different venue, organized at a different level of the no matter the state museums, private museums, all the academic the museums, all the private galleries, commercial galleries too. But we see the trying to as a scholar, we're trying to study this contemporary ink. It's not very easy. This show actually I curated just in April, the past April, at the Sichuan Academy of Fine Arts, and this is also that time, same as this talk. I'm trying to quite ambitious, trying to show the people what kind of the contemporary trends of the all ink art. It's quite a large show, including the more than 37 artists' work, and including the more than 100 the artworks there. Trying to give you kind of the idea about this contemporary ink, but we do have trying to balance the major all the major trends we see in China, and also these artists mainly is a work in the recently is very active in the contemporary ink, no matter they work in what kind of styles, but mainly the only thing we care is their media, their ink. So we include their work. Some is more kind of traditional, and some more the contemporary you can see here. And besides this kind of the comprehensive show, we also see that in the recent years, many kind of very serious exhibition organized for kind of senior the art artists, no matter they are already passed away or they are still active, for these kind of the pioneer of the modern contemporary ink. Like this one, actually, just Judy and I just organized, curated for the Asian Art, Asia Society Hong Kong, just opened a few days ago. This is the artist Fang Zhaoling, possibly some of you know here, because Xujia's museum, the Asian Art Museum, actually have quite a lot of Fang Zhaoling's work. She donated to the museum. And she is quite an international, well-known artist, and died in 2006. But during her more than 50 years of art career, she created a very unique kind of art style with her this kind of very the dramatic the personal life. So this artist, as a woman artist, is very unusual and very well as a woman in painters stand up in the 20th century. So this artist, the work you can see here in the Asia, in the Society Hong Kong Center, and with more than about 50 works, including painting and calligraphy, showing her career. And also some artists that maybe more familiar with, like Liu Guosong, this kind of we usually call him the father of the modern ink. So he would start this kind of the trends in the 1960s, and in the recent years had a serious kind of the large exhibition of Liu Guosong exhibit in many different places. So this one may be the one the more kind of comprehensive and kind of attractive of the Liu Guosong's work held in Shanghai last in the 2006 in the April and May. And I curated a show for the Shanghai Art Museum. So this will give you collect almost all the major the works from the different periods, start from the 1950, late 1950 to the 21st century. You can see here, and include many works actually the first shown. And like the artist Pan Gongkai, I think he possibly know him too many. He's the Pan Tianshou's son, and also the president of the former president of the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and also the China Academy for Arts in Hangzhou. And he, after he stepped down as the president, he devoted his entire life to painting. So actually he's a really talented artist. In myself, I think that his brushwork is actually as strong as his father, at least. So this exhibition is also exhibited in the Shanghai Art Museum in the last December, and also the early May of this year, and showing more than 100 his very huge work. He can, but his father is the famous as paints the large works during the 1950s. But at that time, this large, so-called size of large work, now compared to Pan Gongkai, is only maybe the 1/10 or the 1/20th. So he painted such the energetic and also the beautiful brushwork, and to deal with kind of the challenge the composition and challenge the size. The work you can see here. This is the many kind of works shown. This is a really beautiful show, and also with such this literary kind of taste that you can see in his work. And also some the pioneers of the contemporary ink, like Guwenda, actually recent years also have several kind of the solo show is mainly is kind of retrospective show, including his work start from the early the 1980s. This is the contemporary ink start. did really the pioneers, one of the pioneers of this trend. And this show is also in the 21st century Minsen Museum in Shanghai, and gave the very good survey. You can see this is start from the early 1980s. Really the time the young faculty at the China Academy of Arts in Hangzhou, and doing a kind of very brave ink exploration on ink art, and including his performance here too. And this also this show, because the very large show. This hundreds of works there, including this video and the photos, and give you the very good sense. I think this kind of show is really served a very important role for the study of this art, and also have several artists who can know possibly quite familiar as the Bay Area, like Li Huayi's work. So also recently have several series show in China. This one's now just opened a few days ago in Suzhou Museum. This the very beautifully installed show. And also, like the Li Qing artist, this more kind of joyful, playful on the works of Li Qing, and famous as depicted all the kind of the scenes surrounding him. And recently also have the several solo shows. I think this kind of very mature, well-established artist in the recent years actually start getting the very more serious kind of exhibition in the many different kind of venues. Also can provide a very good source for the people's study of the contemporary ink, start from early. And this is the artist Liu Qinghe, the professor of the Tianjin Art Academy, and this the work, and also like the artist Shen Qing, and this also the Shanghainese artist, and this is also the series show there. Shown here, the Wang Chuan is also the pioneer of the abstract ink, start from the middle of 1980s as one of the major player in the 85 the arts movement. Is also have the series show in recently. Like this Liang Quan is also the Shanghainese, but mainly work in Shenzhen and Guangdong, and we can see also have the series show there. These are also his work. And some younger artists in recent years also come out. These kind of well trained and well established now. This artist like a woman, the artist Wei, and recent years also showing in the many different places, including Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and also in the U.S. We see here this is her show. This show is in Suzhou Museum. Suzhou Museum is a very good place, not only because the elegant building by the Yuan Pei, but also they have the great contemporary art space there. In the recent years, organized a series of contemporary shows, including some much younger artists like Li Tingting, born in the 1980s, Chinese called Ba Ling Hou. This kind of artists also start come out to appear in the many kind of the exhibitions. Okay, I think my time's up. I just stop here. Sorry for just hope you can enjoy.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm exceptionally tall, as you can see, so I'm trying to get the microphone to be more directional to 195 centimeters. But it's great to be here today, and thank you all for coming. I'm actually very, very excited to be here because so often I am asked to talk about Andy Warhol, having been the director and chief curator of the Andy Warhol Museum for 8 years of my career, and certainly to talk about international contemporary art in my current role as Senior Vice President of Contemporary Art at Sotheby's. So to be able to go back to my old world of Asian art is a pure thrill. As an undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh, I worked on Momoyama-era Japanese screen painting, with an emphasis on castle architecture and the depiction of Japanese castles of the era as painted in these beautiful Rakugaiju screens of the 16th and century. So, it's very nice to be back here talking about Asian art and its legacy on contemporary art. And I've always been very intrigued by that which is known as East and that which is known as West. And certainly the two have always been compared, contrasted, juxtaposed. A lot of essentializing has happened over the decades of art historians on both sides, from both places, talking about Western works and Eastern works vis-a-vis one another. I hope that today in 2017 that we are living in a much more integrated world where voices from all corners of the globe have fused together to create new dynamic hybrids that really become their own thing, not East, not West, but purely of the world and global. But I want to throw a little bit of a wrench into the gears of what we know as ink painting, and of course everybody knows Jackson Pollock and his works on paper made with ink in the early 1950s, late 1940s, this being an exquisite example from the collection of MoMA in New York. It's always interesting to think about the abstract expressionist painters who were heroicized in so many ways as the absolute ideals of freedom, of expression. They were, of course, said to have read D.T. Suzuki and all of his great insights on Zen. They were looking at Chinese ink painting, they were looking at Japanese ink painting. Some of them owned the fact that they were looking there for reference. Motherwell, of course, Pollock to a degree, whereas Franz Klein would have nothing to do with it and certainly not admit that he was looking at Eastern painting per se. But I've always thought very carefully about what ink painting in the traditions of China and Japan means. It is a decades-long commitment to craft, to skill, and the artists themselves live in many ways, rigid sets of rules in terms of how one becomes a master, how one is celebrated, how one's hand is analyzed, how it really becomes a lifelong journey, not so much about freedom per se, but about focus and really determination to depict something so beautifully that your peers and your colleagues finally give you that title, that role of master. I'm also, by the way, a feminist art historian, so whenever I use the term master, I get a little bit nervous, but that's generally the term that we use today, so I say that in great scare quotes. But I've always been intrigued by how these ideals, these tenets coming from the East, coming into the abstract expressionist lexicon, all of a sudden were morphed into a very different thing that was about the freedom of expression, ultimately about democracy. Many of the Abex painters were celebrated by the United States State Department itself in the Cold War eras as the ideals of freedom, as the ideals of democracy, as though their soul had simply exploded out in absolute freedom of gesture. And I've also been really intrigued about what later artists have done with these concepts of freedom, of gesture, of action, and how that turns into a form of rebellion. Very different from its origins, I would tend to think. But certainly an area for debate and something we shall discuss. But Kazuo Shiraga, one of the great Gutai Japanese painters, this his masterpiece from 1963 with alternative titles in English translation, either Wild Boar Hunting or Wild Boar Hunt, as you can see, is an incredibly rich, violent canvas. It in so many ways embodies the murderous rampage of a hunter having recently killed a wild boar. Blood splayed, the idea of fur splayed out on the canvas, very much front and center. Of course, the Gutai artists were in so many ways concerned with action as rebellion against a rather an interesting period in Japanese history, the immediate post-war, under American occupation and trying to find an essential Japanese voice to, in many ways, stand out against this, but also having itself been incredibly influenced by the West, namely art informel. Artists like Tapier coming to Japan and meeting with the Gutai artist and giving their ideas, their manifestos over to the artists, who then took them in very, very different and intriguing directions. This is a great image of Shiraga in his studio, actually performing one of his paintings. And I think the term performance really has to happen whenever we talk about any gestural work, but especially here with Shiraga, who is quite literally swinging around his paintings, having a rope installed in his studio where he would swing back and forth, his feet, the paintbrush, mashing through the paint, giving you, as we back up, that incredibly gestural and violent display of paint. Today, Shiraga is an incredibly esteemed and incredibly valued artist, not only in Asia, but in the West as well. He really has come to stand as the most successful of the Gutai artists on the commercial front, and his work has been celebrated not only in museum exhibitions the world over, but certainly in market prices as well. He is, however, a bit of a rarity and an exception, and the artists that I'll show you henceforth, all who happen to be from the West, don't really have much of a market presence at all, and yet their work is so indelibly tied to the traditions of ink and their own specific interests in both Japan and China and time spent there. Helene Elon, has anyone in this room heard of Helene Elon? Yay! Fantastic. That's good that there are two, which is quite rare that there are even two. I'm happy to tell you that Sotheby's is now working with Helene and helping her with her body of work and with her estate planning. She's 86 years old. And I had the great pleasure of doing an exhibition with Helene at the Andy Warhol Museum a few years ago in a series that I did called The Word of God, where I asked artists to come and look at different world faiths through their art making. Helene, it should be noted, is from Brooklyn and from an Orthodox family. And her father was a rabbi. She married young, had a child, and her husband died quite young, in his late 20s, so she was widowed by the time she was 30. She decided she really didn't like the constraints of her Orthodox family, its rules, its regulations, its huge misogyny, and she said, enough of this, I'm becoming an artist. And she certainly, in her later work, was quite interested in the ideas of religion, the language of religion, but her early work from the late 60s and the 1970s is fully infused by her passion for Japan and its traditions of ink painting and painting in general, namely monoha. It's really interesting, this painting, which is called Breaking with Greater Resistance from 1978, has resistance, as you see, in its title. It is an act of rebellion. It is a breaking away from tradition, from culture, from what she knew. These paintings are done so incredibly interestingly as a group effort, using a combination of latex and resin and oil, pure oil, the kind you would put into a car, laid down onto canvas and allowed to coagulate, if you will. And this series of chemical products that she used form a membrane on the front of the canvas, and the liquid oil is embedded within this membrane. She would then hang the painting on the wall of the gallery, and eventually, through gravity, through the liquefaction of the oil inside, trying to penetrate the membrane, eventually this membrane would burst open and stain the remainder of the canvas with the contents of this, this bulge on the front. And I just love the idea that it's an action in and of its own right, but one that plays out over a number of days and a number of hours, never fully knowing when that pack, that sack, is going to burst to complete the painting. And yet, when you look at the monoha artist, and certainly the very concepts of ink painting as well, it's all there. Helene is also those of you that know her in person, is a very, very spiritual person. She, to this day, wears a turban wrapped around her head and is rather goddess-like in and of her own right, and very smart and brash and tough as well.
So,
And the
was
margins.
this done in Berkeley?
Berkeley, yeah. So Helene's story is so interesting. She was really, really celebrated in the late 60s and early 70s. She was in group shows with all the minimalists, all of the land artists. She was super close to all of the names that we remember today. And then she moved out here to Berkeley and started doing these works in the late 70s. But around this time, just after, she decided to literally go off into the sunset and started her Earth Ambulance project, where she got an old ambulance and started to drive around the American Southwest, gathering soil from sacred sites around the Southwest, more or less disappearing from the grid. She showed with Betty Parsons in New York up until Betty died in 1981, and has never had a commercial gallery since that time, sadly. But all of the breakings were made here in the Bay Area in Berkeley, and are actually all still here, and have been ever since they were made in a storage facility here. And we're now working with her to make sure the world knows about these, and that they're incredibly relevant and important paintings today. Helene, we can safely say, was one of the very first artists in the eco-feminist movement, and I certainly want to make sure that art history remembers her and her work. I can guarantee none of you thought you would come here today to see a street artist, Ramel Z, a New York street artist working in the late 1970s as a teenager on the A train in New York, tagging, working up until the end of his life in 2010 when he died at the young age of 50. This is one of his works, Iconoclast Panzerism, the letter K. And I've just always thought how much street artists have really carried on the traditions of the movement and the gestures of ink. And some will have known the traditions and some will have paid attention, many others not. Ramel Z paid very specific attention. He was completely in love with the idea of Japan, of Japanese kabuki theater, Japanese ink painting, the idea of the release of anything from your system through gesture, through the brush of ink. And he decided to do that through a spray can of spray paint. This is an incredibly cool and rare picture of him in his studio painting. Ramel Z is responsible for Jean-Michel Basquiat being Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat was from an upper middle class family and really didn't know the street much at all. Ramel Z was the artist who introduced Jean-Michel to the streets and in many ways gave him his street cred, so that he learned the vocabulary of the street, that he learned hip hop, and they actually created an album together. And Ramel Z is a central figure in several Basquiat canvases. So we're very happy also, I can happily say, to be working with Ramel Z's estate. And we just this week sold 2 of his works, breaking the auction record for a work on paper of Ramel Z, and a lot of exciting things to come there. Theresa Burns, a phenomenal artist from Australia, this is her work called Trace. It's a performative piece made in 2007. Theresa is a painter, and over the course of her late 20s into her early 30s started to suffer from a very severe form of ataxia, meaning that her body functions started to stop working, her muscles started to stopped working, and she's now confined to a wheelchair and has to have a motorized device in order to navigate the world. But that didn't stop her, and she decided that she could use her body as a tool, her body as a brush, and she too has studied extensively Japanese calligraphy and Chinese ink painting as well, and realized that her body could be the brush. So this is exactly what she does, performative gestures. I'm glad that you showed Gu Wenda's, because obviously Gu was in there as well. And so too is Theresa, literally dousing her body in black paint and rolling around the canvas to enact and exact her own notion of ink. And this phenomenal artist, Roland Flexner, a French artist based in New York, this is one of his ink bubble drawings, and I love nothing more than going to Roland's studio. He showed with D'Amelio Terrace Gallery while they were open for many, many years. But he's a true master of ink, so much so that even the great masters of Japanese ink painting share their powders with him, they share their ideas with him, and they share stories with him, which I always think is a very good sign that one has succeeded in being truly a master. What he does in these ink bubble drawings is to combine ink powder with dish soap, basically, detergents, to get a bubble effect, which he then whirls together, whizzes together, and then lays out onto the paper. They're absolutely exquisite, capturing this fluidity and sense of motion, and I would highly recommend that you all take a much closer look at his work. But in the end, I would just love us to think more about the idea of ownership over the ideas of East and West, and I wanted to end by showing the work of Max Gimlet. Max is an artist based in New York City. If you're ever happening to find yourself in front of the new museum, look up, and on the third floor of the building directly to the right of the new museum, you will see a cutout cardboard shape in the form of a quatrefoil in the window. That is Max's studio. That happened to be Rosenquist's studio back in the day, and when Max is no longer with us, we'll convert ownership over to the new museum to become gallery space. But Max is an ordained Buddhist monk and spent many, many years living and studying in Japan, and I love that he's the most famous living artist from his home country of New Zealand, where he is literally the most well-known living artist, represented in galleries and exhibitions there quite often. Yet through the traditions and imagery of ink. And this is one of his great 80-inch large tondos called Clover. And when you see Max painting in his studio, it is unreal. He starts off by doing a meditative gesture, and then all of a sudden, pardon my French, all hell breaks loose. And he lets a huge guttural burst of sound forth to release his soul, and then in usually one very big motion completes these paintings, as you can see here with a huge mop. But they're absolutely phenomenal. Max is well into his 80s now, and I hope will be remembered not only as a great New Zealand artist and a great painter, but also just a great world artist in general. So I will end there, and thought it might be fun to show you a grouping of artists that I assume most of you are not aware of, who are still very, very much engaged with the concepts of ink. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here and learning a lot, I should say. There's an extra pair of glasses up here. Someone may have left, by the way. You didn't to feel the light. No, no mind. So I have just a few remarks in response to the program theme of contemporary art from global perspectives, and some thoughts about ways of referencing or mobilizing the early global, as I understand it, in recent and contemporary, primarily Chinese art. So this is to some degree a byproduct of my current teaching on China and the early modern world. I'm kind of engaged with this material in general, but it did seem worth noting that in addition to strategies of addressing and or cultivating a global audience among contemporary world artists, Chinese in particular, there's a significant legacy of the early global of the 16th to 18th centuries that resonates with contemporary practice and production. And my main pretty simple point is that in our current preoccupation with contemporary globalism, it's maybe easy to forget or neglect the prominent role that China played in the early modern, particularly the 17th and 18th century global or world system of art production and consumption. So these are familiar, these kinds of transnational productions of elements of Portuguese and Buddhist culture, visual culture mixed in these early blue and whites from the 16th century in response to the expansion of the Portuguese world empire. The arenas and art media of the early modern global era in which China played such a prominent role are of course very well explored, but they're so various that it's sometimes hard to keep them all in mind. They included exchanges, as I note here, in porcelain trade and circulation, certainly textiles, often involving South Asia as well, and Japan, in garden culture and its associated values, among others, other media that extended to architecture and furniture, certainly in their chinoiserie incarnations in Europe, and sometimes less commonly noted arenas such as cartography and tea culture. So I want just briefly to survey some contemporary references and deployments of these media that figured in both material exchanges and in the formation of cultural imaginaries. Porcelain seems a fitting place to start since it was involved in global trade for so long and in such volume, and was so readily, as we've seen, adaptable to diverse cultural markers. So we see going back to the mid-16th century in the previous examples and running through the mid-18th here, commissioned work of export ware, in this case the European vessel forms that evoke this network of global trade and circulation that was central to the distribution of global forms and systems. In this case, the contemporary, or not today, but within a generation, 20 years or so, as most of my examples will be, includes Ni Hai Feng, whose career as an emigre artist working in the Netherlands, this point around 2000, referenced the deep connections of Holland or the Netherlands and the VOC or the Dutch East India Company, which was based there, and with the early porcelain trade. This project is as you see, the self-portrait is part of porcelain export history, in which he, as some other artists have done, marks his body in a kind of body painting or tattooing into a kind of commodity, so that participates, in this case, in the contemporary global circulation of art and artists. The body painting includes, as you see, a kind of plate shape and designs evocative of export ware. Sometimes texts related to the production history of porcelain consumption, especially period texts of that early era. Other Qing porcelains incorporate foreign figures in narrative settings, such as these this Kangxi era plate with its party of bewigged musicians in a garden setting, and with some romantic or even erotic overtones. This suggested to me some resonance with some of Liu Jianhua's very familiar porcelain sculptures of qipao-clad female torsos that are served up as objects of voyeuristic or erotic consumption in sometimes very literal ways, and which sometimes use historical designs, porcelain designs for the background plate settings. And here I've flipped it around so you can see the background image right side up, kind of broad terrace with gathered figures and surrounding garden settings that evokes, again, something of that same aura as the Kangxi plate that we were just looking at. And some, of course, broadly contemporary projects conceptually reference even earlier episodes of long-distance intercultural exchange, such as Tsai Chang's famous Venice Biennale mid-1990s multimedia performance, this Bringing to Venice What Marco Polo Forgot, which evokes a deep cultural imaginary of exotic cultural transfers. A more abstract exercise in imagined cultural hybridity from around the same mid-90s period was Huang Yongping's Lagrange, here from '98, which is executed in the language of architectural structure with this timber frame, posts and beams and bracket arms engaged with the stone arcades of the surrounding building. The early modern European chinoiserie imaginary of Chinese architecture tended to focus more on kind of hipped roof, sloped roofs, and lattice windows than on the kind of core structural elements of the tradition and the bracket sets and framework and so on. But this goes a little bit out of order. William Chambers' mid-18th century illustrated treatise on Chinese architecture and design did illustrate, as you see in the lower cutaway view, elements of the timber frame structural system, and illustrations of garden architecture from around the same era, mid-18th century milieu of the English, so-called Anglo-Chinese garden and its decoration and furnishings display at least a comfort with close juxtapositions of these seemingly incongruous classical, respectively classical on your right, and Chinese architectural forms, even if it didn't extend to their full kind of integration or intersection, as in Huang Yongping's project. Cartography was another important arena of early modern exchange that very directly addressed global or world-scale visualizations and imaginations. The impact of Jesuit cartography from Matteo Ricci's world maps from, in this case, from around 1602, and other times Verbiest's later 17th century complete world maps, the subject of a great recent exhibition many of you, I think, have seen at the Asian Art Museum, are notable examples. Relatively, again, recent, if not contemporary today, counterpart could be found in Hong Hao's Selected Scriptures project, again from the mid-90s, with themes, as you see here, like a new political or administrative world map with its reshuffling of entities and cultures in a new kind of global system, according to reshuffled according to an unfamiliar and challenging logic, while retaining the basic continental boundaries and contours and sometimes national contours. And perhaps more pointed relevance to our very contemporary global situation might be another work in the same series of Honghao, the World Defense Layout Map with its worldwide tracks of vectors of conflict. Some artists seem to return to themes of global cultural transfers or exchanges repeatedly, either through explicit references or in terms of parallels that are open to recognition or discovery. Hong Yongping and Sai Guochang already cited are two such. And I think Ai Weiwei can be added to the group. We recall that the 18th century chinoiserie treatises on architecture and gardens and furniture design, for example, included images like this, these kind of structurally curious versions of Chippendale Chinese chairs. And I reference Ai Weiwei's early project from late 90s in hybrid Ming-style furniture construction that yielded these functionally useless and structurally improbable forms, but still retaining elements of historical, stylistic, and material reference. Tea culture was another arena that shaped the European imaginary of China, as well as altered patterns of consumption and lifeways. And this is an illustration that goes back to Johann Neuhoff's famous mid-17th century illustrated account of the Dutch East India Company embassy to the Emperor of China, the court of China. It was a source for many borrowed or reproduced images that were part of the larger chinoiserie imaginary of China in later publications as well. The suggested counterpart here would be something like Ai Weiwei's Tea House from 2011, an installation that evokes something of the volume of tea commerce in early modern periods, and also references the caped or bricked forms in which tea was shaped for efficient long-distance transport to support that kind of cultural consumption interchange. And finally, of course, is very well-known Circle of Animals projects from around the same time, around 2011, of course, explicitly references the European pavilions, fountains, and sculptures at the Yanmingyan in Beijing, and their historic, violent histories of removal and relocation and later circulation, which his project, of course, directly addresses. And another aspect of Chinese garden culture that had a substantial impact on the European imaginary were the these are respectively some of the zodiac animal heads that made it to auction, and eyes gilded versions of them that shaped the anyway the garden cultural element that shaped the European imaginary were the elaborate perforated taihu stones or metamorphic garden stones and grotto-like caverns that 17th century visitors, again in this case Neuhoff, understood as his translated rendering of the original Dutch as cliffs made by art, so both seemingly natural but artful at the same time. And but this example again of a very well-known serial production of John Long's stainless steel rocks that seems to convey, in this particular instance, something of the same kind of bristling and aggressive qualities that appeared in the illustrated version of Neuhoff's travel account. I want to just conclude these brief remarks. I'm trying to get us a little bit back on schedule. To cite another work that belongs to the realm of garden culture. It's the most contemporary and local in some respects of my examples. That's Cho Jie's World Garden wall drawing or mural that was the inaugural installation in the art wall space of the new Berkeley Art Museum last year. I'm sure many of you visited it as well. It's a both conceptually and visually complicated work. Centers, as you see, around this great sort of vaguely China-shaped lake in the center of a sprawling composition that includes references to early modern Chinese gardens of the sort that had an impact, certainly in European culture of the 18th century. The mountain hamlet, the Bishu Shanzhuang, the mountain hamlet for escaping the summer heat is evoked. I think I have details that show a little better. It's kind of in the bottom half of the edge of the composition as well. At least potentially as of the Yuanmingyan, which is often rendered as the garden of perfect brightness. And here, I think, is tagged as the garden of reciprocal enlightenment in a inventive and thought-provoking translation or rendering. And there are many, all primarily pre-modern garden cultures and eras that are variously mapped or named, labeled, sometimes depicted pictorially or conceptually. Zen gardens, Persian gardens, formal European, early modern and also classical Roman gardens, as well as imaginary and conceptual, metaphoric, and symbolic gardens, above all, which are the largest component. Let me just run through. This is the installation in the Berkeley Art Museum foyer space, art wall space, and this gives you at least a little bit closer view of some of the labeling and features that have elements of landscape and garden painting, sometimes rendered spatially, sometimes again sort of semi-cartographically, and otherwise conceptually. And as you can see, these central features, the lake of seasons and weathers, and lake of lonely happiness, and so on, represent ideas and aesthetic values that sometimes attach to particular gardens, but no specific garden genre or cultural tradition, as you see. And these, again, are the kind of influential images of Chinese imperial gardens as they were conveyed to Europe in the early 18th century. Ripa's famous engravings of the mountain hamlet at Chengde, or Ruhe, as he labeled them, and of course the European pavilions at the Yuanmingyan, but the larger complex, the Chinese pavilions, now lost, were also the subject of famous reports by European visitors, that letters sent by Jean-Denis Atelier and others back to Europe to help to shape the imagined Asian or Chinese garden as it was iterated in England and elsewhere. And this